and welcome to the next episode of As the Badge Turns. I'm Scott Nocon, joined always by retired Sheriff Rich Stanek. And this week, excited to welcome Jim Martin to the show. And Jim, I know you have a very, very impressive background and history, so I'll let you kind of just detail that out for us. But again, thank you for making the time today. I think you're on the road. I think you're always on the road somewhere.
It feels like it. Yeah, it feels like it.
So welcome to the show.
Scott, thanks so much, Sheriff Stanek. It's always a pleasure to see you. This is a real thing, man. I was looking at some of your podcasts. I was like, man, what am I doing on this thing? You must have been had a couple cancellations or something. But thanks for having me. I look back at my story, and I think the word illustrious is too strong. It's just kind of what we fall into, right? But to those who might not know me, my name's Jim Martin. I'm a former law enforcement. I was a sheriff's deputy in southern Indiana. I was a deputy for Vanderburgh County, which is in Evansville, the very southern tip, right on the Ohio River. I retired as a lieutenant, which was the highest merit rank that we have in Vanderburgh County. In the last 10 years, I ran our facility as an assistant jail commander. So um, a little bit of everything. I mean, our sheriff's office, we do patrol, we did investigations, we provided security for the courts, ran the jail, did warrants, tax warrants, evictions, all sorts of number of things. And I was lucky enough to have a pretty um, diverse career as a motor patrol deputy, both on second shift and third shift. And I was named a canine handler. That was a really exciting part of my career. And, I really enjoyed that. Gave me some opportunities to experience law enforcement from a different lens. And then in our county, when you get promoted, you start going into the administrative side of some of, the jails and the courts and things like that. So I was a sergeant in our old jail. And then I was a sergeant and supervised our court security unit, which amazingly enough, you kind of alluded to, the life after law enforcement. All of these things that I took from these assignments were pieces that developed how my career would take off. And believe it or not, my time with the courts was some of my most developmental time because I'm seeing these affidavits every day. I'm interacting with attorneys, defense, prosecutors, state's attorneys, civil actions, criminal actions, uh, divorces and small claims, and meeting our judiciary and interacting with them. And they're normal people. They're not always the black robe you see behind the bench. They're
Mm.
people that you can actually talk to and enjoy a round of golf with and see out in the community. And that made me a better communicator. Self-admittedly, when I wrote my reports, I was the one that wrote books and novels in my affidavits. And when meeting some of the magistrates and the judges, were like, "You're the one. Stop that. We got to read this stuff when we're on the beach, when or on the bench, when we're trying to decide whether we're going to hold them or not, formally charge them. And that's a lot to read. So it was a joke after the fact, but very I developed some of my skills in the courts. And then we built a new jail. I was part of the transition team with that. I was in professional standards. The sheriff at the time said this is one of those positions you're going to learn more about the sheriff's office that you ever wanted to, but you're also probably going to hate it because part of that was internal affairs and background checks and things like that. And it was not tough to defend our deputies to complaints from our community. What was tough is when some of those acts meant that their career in law enforcement was over. But that's part of it, right? So and then finally, the sheriff said, "Hey, go to the jail for 1 year," and I stayed for 10. But that really did, was very developmental in leading to where I'm at right now. And believe it or not, Sheriff Stanek, you're a big part of it as well. When I first started to think, what's next for law enforcement for me, do I have aspirations of being sheriff? Yeah, any deputy has aspirations of one day running for sheriff, and so did I. But when I saw that window of opportunity was closing or had closed, I thought, I'm not going to be one of those cartoon character sheriffs that the belt's hanging down off their side and they're bent over and deputies are running for cover because the muzzle of their weapon's pointing at them. And I was like, what's going to happen after that? And so that's when I started thinking about what the next step for me was. For me, it was going back and getting a higher education. When I was hired, the sheriff had mandated at the time that every one of his deputies would have at least a bachelor's degree. And so that forced me to to finish college. I had started college, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, got in the way for that. But then I got hired by the sheriff's office. And, then you're going through training in FDO and you're starting a family. But signing that agreement that, yes, I will get my degree was one of the best things that the sheriff could have made me do. But then fast forward 10 years is like, okay, what's next? And, from the lens I was looking through, you have to have a higher level education. And so I went back, working nights, going to school during the day and to get my master's degree. And back to Sheriff Stanek, that qualified me to be asked to be a consultant on a study we did, um, mental health, what sheriffs across the country were doing in their jails. And I was hired as a technical writer consultant, but then kind of took on the role as director or program development in that, and visited what 15 facilities across the country and
Hmm.
saw what they were doing, comparing it to what we were doing. We were, blessed to go to the sheriff's facilities, meeting with some of his staff, and that was an eye-opening um, experience for me to know. Okay, now I know a name of what it is that you get out of law enforcement, like, how do you say what you did? You're in law enforcement. But the career of law enforcement is like a little city. I mean, you do everything. You're, from the government side, from the utility sides, from the infrastructure side. And now I could kind of pinpoint that program manager or consultant was something that I could, lend my talents to. And that led from one thing to another and to another and to another. Then after 23 years, they came knocking on the door and said, "Hey, you've got experience in supervising the healthcare of a facility. You've got experience with the mental health crisis that our sheriffs are experiencing. You've got, a pulpit and a story to tell. Come tell it for us at the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare." So um, I did the math. In Indiana, or at least with our pension, 20 years at age 50, if you left early, then there was a deduction. But I'm the youngest of 9 kids, and as hard as any of my brothers and sisters have done things to try to kill themselves, they lived till they're 80. So I just did the math and said, "I'll make up those percentage points. Let's see what's out there." So that catapulted to life after law enforcement for me. So kind
So
of capsulizes it real quick.
no, it does, and I appreciate that. So let's unwind that back to, and you did. It is illustrious. You've been in a number of different
Mm.
positions, and I love that story that you told, because one kind of complemented the next, right? It kind of set you up for it. What got you down the path to begin with? Where was your interest first peaked to say, I'm going to go down this road?
Just opportunity knocking. I was an average student. I could get by without studying real hard, which is not the message for any of those out there. I mean, study hard. There's so many more things. I could have skipped a lot of steps. Um, the, the law, the rule of law, always kind of um, intrigued me a little bit. Back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, I did have judges in my bloodline in my family, but I knew that after the fact. Um, Again, I was youngest of 9. My dad worked at Whirlpool. My mom was a nurse. I mean, there wasn't a lot of money going around. I think I got my first pair of jeans when I was 16, and I knew that at the time some of the guaranteed student loans had gone away, and I wanted to go to college. I didn't know where. I thought I was going to be a journalist, quite frankly. And then I saw that using the military as a path to getting the GI Bill and education was a path that was available to me. So I took that. I didn't grow up thinking, "Man, I want to be in the military." I'm a proud U.S. Marine. Was in the reserves when Desert Storm and Desert Shield popped up. Never thought I'd actually get called up for active duty service, but we did. That's really what opened up the doors of what came next. It opened up a door for a VA home loan. It opened up for my VA school loans. The sheriff that hired me was a former Marine, and people were scared to death to talk to him. I wasn't. Again, just like the judges, it's a human being. You go over there and say hello. You start a conversation. Um, there was such pride coming back from Desert Storm. And I've told this story before. I feel bad for our veterans before me because they didn't get this level of respect that they deserved. And in some ways, the ongoing conflicts that we've experienced since then, it's almost become the norm. They were like, "Oh, you're deployed. You're coming back, great." There were people lined up from the airport to our reserve center. I mean, bumper to bumper, both lanes of traffic, all four lanes of the highway going to where we were going. There was a sense of patriotism and pride in our military service, and at that time, the Vanderburgh Sheriff's Office was hiring. It was a 2-year process for me at that time. Sheriff, I don't think they're seeing it anymore, but they're like 400, 500 applicants
Mhm.
for 30 positions that might happen in the 2 years. You're going to be put on a 2-year list. I made I think I was number 11 of a list of 20 that they were going to hire in 2 years. Now they hire 20 a year, 18-year-olds straight out of high school. Um, that's really what drove. And then, from that, I was a volunteer fireman before that. I was an EMT before that. The family joke was I'll never have a job that I don't wear a uniform. And it, when I left the sheriff's office, the world of color opened up to me because I didn't have to wear my, two-tone brown anymore. It's like there are colors out there. Now I wear colorful socks just because I can.
Yeah.
So just the sense of service, the sense of patriotism, giving back, and the timeline of my life opened up the doors to where I'm at today. There was no. I was born to be a cop. It wasn't me looking at the parade and seeing the firemen and saying, one day that's going to be me. A door of opportunity opened and I took advantage of it.
Scott, I mean, Jim's got that its story going back 23 plus years of dedicated service, both to our country and the armed forces, to the law enforcement service, and then he ends up in the private sector where he's just as successful. All the lessons learned, everything that he could possibly grab and take in, he did, and now here we are. You're probably in your late 40s, early 50s, maybe a little bit older than that,
A little
but
bit
you're
older
a
than that.
bit older than that. And, you've got friends all over the country. You've had a very successful career,
Yeah.
multi-level career. Um, but the one thing you said that really struck me was about the mental health piece, right? You probably saw it in the military service. You certainly saw it in law enforcement and
Mhm.
working in the jail environment. You've seen it because this is what you focused on in the private sector side. Uh, Tell us a little more about that because that's how I got to know you 10,
Yeah.
12, 13 years ago.
Yeah. 2015, 11 years almost to the day. Yeah. You know, my exposure to the correction side of law enforcement, the correction side of a jail setting, um, all I knew is I brought him in the back door. I pulled him over, I arrested him, I tracked them, we brought him in, and I saw that piece of it. And then when I became a jail supervisor as a sergeant, again, it was an old facility, right? Um, but I always tell people you got to think for them 72 hours before and after they get arrested. That gets into a whole because part of the mental health was also going into let's look at de-escalation skills. Let's look at verbal judo. Let's look at using words instead of force. Which was a new concept. And we've all through our law enforcement careers, we've probably gone through 6 generations of change in law enforcement from the back alley justice to the Rodney Kings to Ferguson to Minneapolis to all the things that we've experienced in our careers. Law enforcement's changed each of those times. But the mental health piece has always been there. When they desegregate, or the desegregate is not the right word, when they shut down some of the state mental hospitals, those people had to go somewhere. Some went to the communities to fend for themselves. Some were placed in long term facilities. Same came to the jails, and I kept hearing this term. Well, our jails are our biggest mental health hospitals. When we started doing that survey, it was like people finally started to realize that like it's been like that forever. Not just because our state hospital shut down, but when people came in, they're in a crisis in some way or level. All three of us. have some sort of mental illness in us. It's just what's going to bring it out. All right. We have coping mechanisms that we can keep that to a level that we operate on a baseline and can, successfully move about in society without it having. But one crisis in our lives could change the course of our life instrumentally. And so when we started talking, I got exposed to this, talking about verbal judo and trying to see things through their lens and listen to them and having this tactical empathy and trying to communicate and paraphrase what I'm hearing you say is this, to one, make sure that they know you're listening, but you kind of bring them, you naturally de-escalate the person. Well, you can use that with someone that's in a normal person in a crisis. You can use that with special mental health needs. You can use that with someone who's off their meds for 6 months, but you've got a moment in time that you can start talking to them. Seeing that and realizing that that's everywhere, that's in our stat. Think 2 or 3, maybe 5 years ago, they start saying, "Wait a minute, we gotta start looking at our own staff too." Yeah, hello, where have you been? It's like another, it's been like that from the beginning. And, we hire so many of our uniformed military service personnel that came in that have seen things, right? And have experienced things, and we're putting them back into environments that have a little bit less structure because they're out on their own walking a beat. They're not with their squad, their platoon, their fire team. I remember one day, we we were working a business zone in our community, and me and another canine handler that was working that shift, we were placing ourselves in this business area outside of our. We weren't patrol. We were out of the car, hiding behind an air conditioning unit in this business area, and waiting for, because we were having break-ins, and we were just waiting. Because the dog certainly is going to hear the sounds and things before you hear them or you see them perk up, something's going on. Well, it was 4th of July, and I didn't realize, and I was not a combat vet. I mean, we heard things, but I wasn't in the middle of chaos, right? Um, but I started hearing these fireworks go off in the background in the community, and I, for the first time, felt that trigger of, where am I at right now? It was hard for me to admit because I didn't feel like I'd been exposed to it, but I realized I did. And now every 4th of July, I think of that, including this last 4th of July. It was like, here it is again. That's a trigger. What am I going to do with that? So all of us, whether, no matter what our backgrounds are, or where we come from, dealing with mental health, with of the population in crisis coming in, those who are off their medications, those that we are trying to figure out, how are we going to get them out of our court system? How can we get them? How can we advocate for them? And then do the exact same thing with the person to our left and right that we're working with. It's a big challenge, but it's also a big opportunity for people like us who are talking about things in this forum, to say, there's a rollout out there for you after you get out of law enforcement. Don't stop thinking about that. So it's a door of opportunity. It's a cracked window for you to climb through.
So your times, and thank you for going through that. It's definitely the kind of thinking through what you're saying, Jim, and yeah, and Sheriff Stanek, thanks for prompting mental illness, because yeah, that has been pretty much on most of the shows. We've probably touched on that for very important reasons. Experience. So there's something to be greatly admired about that. In your current role of, and feel free just to share the name as well. But in your current role now, you're kind of looking at it from a different perspective, right? What do you see? And I guess that my question specifically is, the your what have your past experiences shown you for you now as you approach a situation in in being an in-house medical provider that has,
Yep.
kind of maybe altered over time, but definitely refined and allowed you to say, this is an area that definitely matters, and this is what we need to be able to make a focal point of.
That's a great question. And even before my current role in my occupation now, I always give credit to the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. They gave me an opportunity through these consulting opportunities we spoke about. But then when I worked for the National Commission, starting off in accreditation, just learning the foundation and the infrastructure of how you can run a good correctional healthcare system. I was fortunate. My nurse manager in the jail that I, was a liaison to. I didn't run our medical unit. Our nurse manager did. But I was a liaison for the sheriff's office. So I kind of joked that I was the interpreter because she would come to me and say, this is the problem we're seeing. And I would go back to the sheriff and try to put it into law enforcement speak of this is why it's important to us. We're spending a lot of money on sending people out on dialysis runs. We're taking officers off the road. We can do it in house if we have, a mobile clinic. Do you want to look at those kind of things? That's just one example. I had a great mentor and colleague that showed me the way of how a health system should be ran. Well, it was through using these nationally recognized standards. So when my first opportunity to work part time with them, and again, it's an open door you jump through. Just working part time, what they realized is they hadn't had a law enforcement voice in that organization before. Here I'm a country hick kid from Indiana, Southern Indiana. What in the world do I have any business talking about how to run your medical in your jail? It's because I followed those standards. And what led to my full time position with them is that it was working. We were talking about the mental health standards. There's 3,000 over 3,000 jails and prisons across the country, but less than 5% of those facilities were accredited by this organization. And when they were accredited for health services, which is great. But a lot of the components in that health services standard also apply to mental health. And so that's where I started getting more into mental health. Go that extra step and enhance your mental health services. So building on all of those, using those standards is my Bible for when I talk to sheriffs across the country. Um, what led to that was working with a prison system and to my current employer. But at the time, they called and said, we have a broken system. We're under court monitoring, consent decrees. We have way too many deaths. We want to take it to here. How do we do that? And it didn't start with accreditation. I called it my pathway to success. And the sheriff, I'll tell another story at the end of this. He heard me trying to explain this to one of our first clients. I said, you start with taking an inward look at yourself. Then you take a look at the standards. You learn these standards. Then you invest in your people. You let them know these are the answers to the question why. Why do we want timely receiving screening? Why do we want to do initial health assessment within 7 to 14 days? Why do we want to have med pass at a certain time? All of these things that we started to teach this organization. And taking a broken system within 3 years, they were going through the accreditation process now, and they continue to invest in their people, and they continue to implement things that they were calling NCCHC and me on the other line of the phone saying, we want to do this now. How do we do it? They did everything that I asked them to. And now they're nationally recognized, one of the first, if not the first, prison system to receive the Pinnacle Award from the National Commission, right? Because they've invested that time. Well, 4 years ago, meeting with this owner of this company, he said, hey, we want to take what we've learned, what you've taught us, and scale it to benefit jails in the prison. It's my legacy to give back what I've done as a public health physician for 30 plus years of, I want to give back now. This is my mission. What do you think? And I'd had those discussions with people all the time, pharmaceuticals, med surge, medical supplies, sheriffs, county commissioners. I've had these discussions. They're like, no, that's what we were coming out of COVID. I'm like, you've got it good right now. Why do you want to go make it harder for yourself? I said, just be content. They're like, no, this is our mission. Come to realize that he wanted me to run that and build the stateside company from the ground up. So what I did was just take lessons learned. I knew the mistakes that I had made. I had seen tips and tricks and shortcuts that other companies had made. Some good, some not so good. There are a lot of great correctional healthcare companies out there, bar none, and everyone will say we go by the standards. But what I would see is that being translated down to the people who are actually doing the work, and that's the challenge, right? So that was the biggest lesson: was how can I implement what I believe in and what I've learned to do it myself? And I was fortunate to have a sheriff out of Virginia to call and say, "Can you really do what you said you would do?" I said, absolutely. Again, what's this guy out of Southern Indiana having business? But yes, we can. Give me a chance. Let's do it. And similar story, not quite as drastic as the prison system, but once they start taking an inward look, they realized that some things weren't being done, and so we followed them. We just followed the book. We followed that roadmap. finally got them accredited. Then the next facility came, and then the next facility came. So it was taking the lessons that I learned as a assistant jail commander, taking the great experience I had at NCCHC and putting it into practice the way I thought was the right way of doing it.
There are standards for jails
Mhm.
across the country, standards of care that must be met. And
Yeah.
so you talk about accreditation. For many of our listeners, some of them aren't, as familiar with the criminal justice system or a sheriff's office or a correctional facility. Talk about some of those basic standards that have to be met. I mean, it's not just, I know some people think, well, you just kind of, this guy gets elected, he becomes the sheriff, and now he's running a jail with 1,000 inmates coming and going.
Yeah.
What qualifies him or her is much more to it than that, correct?
Oh yeah. Well, you've got to put the right people around you. When we look for an engagement with an organization, I want to make sure that the sheriff, the jail commander, they believe in what they're saying. And I've seen some great sheriffs that are all in. And I've seen those, going to conferences, and sitting with sheriff. And, I remember this one sheriff, I can't remember what state it was from, which is probably the best, but he said, you're from NCCHC. Don't bring me this accreditation stuff. I don't want to even talk to you about it. And I'm like, well, no, I'm just having lunch. What's your name? Tell me where you're from, kind of thing. And I couldn't leave that well enough alone. I said, I'm a sucker. I said, what is it about the standards? What are about NCCHC accreditation that you don't like? He said, well, if I don't follow those rules you have in that book, then I'm going to get sued. I'm like, well, the standards are meant for a basic infrastructure of how to give constitutional care. Follow the rules are simple. Yeah, but my 18-year-old that's turning a key on the door, if he doesn't turn it the right way, I'm going to get sued. I'm like, well, that's not a standards problem. That's a training standard, problem. So the standards are they're not. I want to be careful because I do not represent NCCC, and I don't want people to misrepresent what I'm saying. They're a living, breathing document, right? They're meant for facilities as small as 10 beds and as large as 10,000 beds. If there are things that you cannot do, the standard probably allows you a backup to do as much as you can and document and still be able to meet the standard, right? Not every facility can provide 24-hour, 7-day a week care. That's why there's a standard for the healthcare liaison that your officers who are there when your healthcare staff isn't are trained enough to know what to do in an emergency and when's the time to call. So it's a document that will allow you to learn as you go. But back to your question, Sheriff Stanek, about a sheriff coming in that has no idea, they need to know what's going on because your medical budget's probably your largest line item in your budget, and it's also your biggest liability. But you need to have people in that facility that are willing to learn the basics, willing to listen to the healthcare providers to say this is what's right and what's wrong. Medical autonomy. If one of your clinicians or your physicians, your provider says, we need to send this person out. Yeah, it's not a good time for us. We'll do it next week. It's not the answer, right? It's giving them that authority. To say if it's what's clinically indicated, let's do it. So it's listening to your people. It's having trust in the system, um, letting the standards live and breathe in your facility, living the accreditation lifestyle every day. And don't think of it as just every 3 years they're going to come and do a checklist. No, you've got to do it because if as soon as you start skipping a step or skimping here or cutting a corner, that's when you're going to see a critical incident that's going to come back
Mm.
and ultimately affect the sheriff.
So in that, Jim, the standards are there for a reason, obviously, and I appreciate you going through to say, well, if I don't do that, I'm going to get sued, or this is going to happen. Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, there is a consequence if you don't follow what is the standard, or the hence the standard operating procedure. In all
Right.
cases, you want that to be the guiding principle. Can you give us an example or two related to where you know, being now an in-house medical provider, right? And
Mhm.
so that added level of importance. Um, any medical emergencies coupled with staffing shortages that have led to some public scrutiny, and how have you been able to navigate through that?
Well, we don't fight our battles through the media, and that's the number one rule. We support our healthcare team, and we've been we've had those kind of news articles out there. It's not fun to see them, but it's also not accurate. I'll give you an example. Um, there's always turnover. There's always, transitions are never easy. And when you see reports that are outdated or just not accurate, it's hard to quiet the noise around you to say, no, this is what we're doing. And it all comes down to documenting it. If it's not in the chart, it didn't happen. You have policies and procedures for a reason. You have nursing protocols for a reason. There are reasons that you follow these standards. And the best example I can give is in our facility, in the jail that I was the assistant jail commander. We were not an accredited facility. They're still not accredited. They're working towards it, but they're not right now. But because my nurse manager followed those standards, anytime that we did get sued, she had the documentation to prove that, yes, that's your question, but this is what we did. And it might be a patient refused the medication. It might be that when they came to take them to an offsite visit, they refused to go, or they fought the officers. You know, you're going to have those, and there's no getting around it. But if as long as you document it clearly of what took place, you do as much as you possibly can to get as adequate as you can. It is defensible. So, even when we had litigation against our facility that wasn't accredited, so we didn't have that accreditation sticker to say, "See, this is how we did it." She had the standards to back up why we did what we did, and that's probably the best example. I mean, you have a framework. It's the same thing. It doesn't have to be healthcare. If there's something with the sheriff's office, you get your policy and procedure. Our deputies, our law enforcement officers followed. This is what it said to do. Right. I remember in the state of Indiana, they came out that it was mandatory. You will arrest for domestic violence. That's what the state law was. So when there was a domestic violence, you had to make an arrest. That was a change from people because law enforcement officers, we have a lot of discretion out there. We have the discretion of writing a ticket, giving a warning, towing your vehicle, making the stop initially, doing a Terry stop, investigating a group of people who are on the street corner. There's a lot of discretion in law enforcement, and you have to be able to be able to maneuver and not be subjected to the Monday morning quarterbacking when you're not there for that split second when a 10-year-old pulls a shotgun on you, which happened to me. And thank God the right decisions were made at the right time.
Being able to transition from active law enforcement into the private sector. Um, and again, just to be clear to our listeners, what stood out to me, and we've had many conversations over the last couple of years, uh, the what happens after the bench, beyond the
Yep.
bench, right? And so that stuck, that stuck in my head for sure. So making that transition from active law enforcement career into the private sector,
Yeah.
how did your life change or not? Aside from you were able to expand your wardrobe colors now, right? As you said earlier,
Exactly.
but certain things never leave you. And me
Right.
never being in law enforcement, but having great respect, my perspective is certainly going to be different. But you know, from the military into law enforcement in jails and all
Mhm.
the different roles, when you went into that private sector, what stood out to you most?
That the quiet was deafening
Yeah.
was the first biggest transition that I remember. And I'm glad you brought us back to the purpose of this. Of there is a lot after law enforcement, and where do you go? I remember sitting in my home office, um, working with the National Commission, and I didn't hear the banging of bars. I didn't hear the voices walking down the hall. I didn't hear fights, constant radio traffic. You kind of tune that out, but you also know when the inflection in someone's voice means I need to pay attention. Where was that? It The silence was deafening. That was the biggest change, right? But what got me there is back to trying to figure out what to call what you want to do. So for my colleagues in law enforcement, like, okay, Jim, how am I going to figure this out? What are the pieces of your career that you thought were the most interesting? Being the liaison of medical was not my most interesting job in law enforcement. It's what got me here today. I mean, honestly, my time spent in of course, the canine, that was just fun, right? My time in the courts and my time in professional standards was my biggest developmental. I mean, I enjoyed doing that stuff. Um, but so I went back to school. Go back to school, make sure you're educated and learn your trade for whatever you find. But find what your niche is. And I'm going to break down to some basic things and tell you a quick story of steps that I took. If you're a taser instructor and you love those tasers, there are taser developers all out there that would love to use you as a salesperson. If you are an IT person and you have that data and you want to, you love the jail management system type of stuff, there are people out there who will love to have you come out there and do it. Um, I went out to some of my colleagues. In Evansville, it was called Leadership Evansville. Now it's Leadership Everyone. And they had, it was a week long kind of retreat, and it was community leaders or business leaders in our community that, we had this retreat. We did a lot of different exercises. We had these, learning colleagues and peers. And one of them was a kid that was a year behind me in high school, not kid. We were all adults, but he was working in banking. And as I was thinking, I'm like, what's next for me? I said, hey, or can we have lunch? I want to talk to you about something. And I kind of started feeling out. You're a successful banker, and I am thinking about what's next for me in law enforcement. What advice would you have for someone like me? And either misunderstood or just being blunt honest. He's like, Jim, I'll tell you right now, I wouldn't hire you. Like, first of all, I don't want to be in banking. Numbers scare the hell out of me. I'm not a numbers guy. And I said, but do tell why. He goes, you're not marketable. I'm like, what do you mean? I've been loyal to the sheriff's office for 20 plus years. How much more marketable? He's like, no. He goes, that's just it. You've been in law enforcement for 20 years. What else have you done? But that got me thinking about that infrastructure of the community within law enforcement. Of there's a lot of the components. I did move around. He's like, oh, we want to hire people now that move every 5 years, which I don't think is accurate. But that in his mind, like, I did move around every 5 years. I was motor patrol, then I was canine, then I was jail, then I was courts, and I was jail again. I was I moved around. But it got me thinking that, okay, so that's what's out for people that don't understand the law enforcement community, or just aren't used to this. They see the people on TV, on the news. This is what they do. That there's more out there. So, to the public out there, yes, your law enforcement partners are multi thinkers. They can multitask. They can, do a number of different things. Look at investing in them. But just making that conscious choice I got to figure out what to call what it is that I want to do. And probably was the hardest challenge for me. Consultant was the closest I got after doing some of the things with Sheriff Stanek and the major county sheriffs and NSA and AJA. Getting involved in those organizations were huge for me too, and networking. I remember, so Indiana, the term limited. So I went through 4 sheriffs, which can be a nightmare if you think about it. The sheriff that I retired under, I saw him at a NSA conference in Washington, D.C., coincidentally. And I was talking to folks like Sheriff Stanek and Sheriff Katugian and some of the big names, right? Your podcast, all of them are listed there. It's like, hey, how do you know that guy? I'm like, well, nice. It's a friend of mine. I got him in speed dial. Would you like to go meet him? You want an autograph for him? Because we see them on the national news. We see them when they turn to communities of, hey, what's going on in Hennepin County? Um, those are it was just funny to see that, you had me in the jail for so many years. You built where I'm at now. So thank you. But that's the kind of thought a lot of our law enforcement partners, deputies, correctional officers think. They're like, this is all we know is what's in the walls or the car that we're driving in the community we're in. So you just gotta find the niche of what it is you enjoy, name it, and then go look for it.
So you kind of alluded to this, but I'll just ask this question um, directly. Then I'll let Sheriff Stanek chime in for sure as well as we wrap up. And again, I appreciate you making the time, Jim.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you.
what advice for sheriffs, jail administrators, deputies preparing for the next chapter of their careers?
I don't know if you and I were talking about this. I've had this conversation recently, and I, this is what it was that we were in a committee meeting at the last NSA conference, and some of the sheriffs who are on their twilight of their career are doing. We had this discussion. What am I going to do after this? I'm a retired sheriff. Do I just come back to these conferences and hang out with people? And we talked about how nice would it be if there was a class at an NSA, at an AGA, at an ACA, you name the law enforcement conference you're going to, that pairs you up with mentors that have been where you're leaving, right? Helping that transition. And I think that is an opportunity for our current sheriffs to look at the recent retirees and be a mentor not only to the new deputies coming into the career, replacing you, but also giving them what they've known of, this is how I transitioned out of law enforcement, and this is in 20 plus years you can do this too. It gives them purpose. So many, some people, they just work till they die, and that's not a good ending of a career either. And we start to do this. As I was ending my career, I remember this discussion with the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office to do exactly that, is have some of the newly retired still be engaged with the sheriff's office by coming into FTO classes or law enforcement trainings. But I think that there's still a place for retired law enforcement deputies, law enforcement police officers, sheriffs to help make that transition to people who are thinking about it 5 years out, 10 years out. I'm leaving right now. But I want to stay connected. I still want to talk to people. Going around to these conferences and watching these sheriffs talk, I just love it. In fact, one last fun story of Sheriff Stanek, only because I owe you a thank you. Again, we were at a conference and I was on a call with a new client, and I felt like I was beating my head against the wall because I had a commissioner that said, "You're providing too much care," which I responded, "Thank you. Let's put that on a bumper sticker. But you have to listen to me. You have to let me do this." And we got off the call, and the sheriff was with another colleague. He's like, "Well, they just listen to you." I'm like, "Sheriff, that's the best compliment you could give me, but this is the biggest challenge of my career." So it's not without it. It's not all roses on the other side either. I mean, there's still challenges, but acknowledge that what I was talking was what sounded right, which was right. So thank you, Sheriff, for that.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, Scott, as we wrap up, because I've got to get to another uh, call, is that, look, I mean, Jim's done everything right. He may not know it yet. He may doubt himself in some respects, but he's done everything right. Admirable service to the country, admirable service to his county and his state, um, providing leadership and mentorship to a number of other people across the country as he's continued on this journey in the private sector. I get a chance to, like you, Scott, to run into him several times a year. He's always got a smile on his face. He's got he knows what he wants to do and he knows how to get it done, and he does it. Who could ask for anything more than that? He's an inspiration to young people who are starting out law enforcement thinking, oh, I'm going to put in 10, 20, 30 years into this career. It is a career. It is a journey. Embrace
Amen.
it. So
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you.
no, absolutely. Yeah, I think we'll just end on that. Again, Jim, thank you so much for making the time. Again, you're always traveling somewhere. I'm sure I'll see you at an upcoming conference. I'm looking at the list right over there. I have 5 this month, so I won't be at all of them because some are at the same time. Go figure.
Yeah.
But yeah, as always, I enjoy every time that our paths cross. It is always a friendly conversation. It's true. I learned a lot more about you today. I appreciate it. It made all the sense in the world to have you on the show. So thank you for representing what you've done, and definitely I look forward to getting this out as soon as we can so others can experience your story. So thank you. Sheriff
Thank
Stan,
you. Appreciate you all.
thank you for your
As the badge turns.
yeah. And guys, again, you can find us everywhere you stream on YouTube as well. And until next time, thank you and have a great day.
All right. Bye, guys. Scott. Jim, thank you.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Hi, I'm Scott with Prime Health Services and Prime Corrections. And when I'm not hosting with Sheriff Stanek, I wanted to take a few moments and talk about our offsite inmate medical cost containment solution. So if you're running a jail and you have to take an inmate offsite for medical treatment of any type, have you ever paid full bill charges for that expense? Hopefully not. But if you have, let Prime help you out. So what we do every day, we receive many bills. I'll give you one example of a bill we just processed this week. This was for a county in Florida. This was for an air ambulance treatment. The total bill, $53,256. Through our scrubbing process and negotiations, we were able to reduce that bill down to $8,447.26. That is, that's a savings of 84%. So if you are looking to save on your offsite inmate medical expense, contact Prime. You can reach us via a link below. You can also send an email directly to corrections@primehealthservices.com. That's corrections@primehealthservices.com. Let Prime show you and let Prime help you save money. Thanks and have a great day.